Greetings, dear friends, and welcome back. We're so pleased you could join us once more for Bedtime Biographies, where together we drift peacefully into the soothing stories of truly remarkable lives. Tonight's journey takes us to a moment of profound transformation, to those final haunting days when one man's dream of peace collided with a nation's birth pangs of violence. Picture, if you will, the winter of 1948 in New Delhi. The air hangs crisp and cool, carrying the scent of marigolds and incense from countless morning prayers. A frail, 78-year-old man walks through the gardens of Birla House, his thin frame wrapped in the simple white cloth that has become his uniform, his signature, his statement. He moves slowly but purposefully, leaning on the shoulders of two young women, his grandnieces, as he makes his way to evening prayer. His name is Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Though the world knows him as Mahatma, the great soul, his destination, a prayer ground where hundreds wait to hear him speak. His fate, just 17 more days of life, though he doesn't know it yet. Before we begin this exploration of those final, fateful days that would indeed change a nation, just a brief, gentle thought. If these calm journeys through history help you unwind at the end of your day, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It genuinely helps other thoughtful minds discover these stories, and we're always curious about your reflections. Please let us know in the comments what you think of Gandhi's legacy and which historical figure you'd like us to explore next in our bedtime biographies. Now, Gandhi's last days are not a simple story of an assassination and its aftermath. There's something far more complex and far more human. A story of a man who had devoted his entire adult life to a vision of independence achieved through nonviolence, who had mobilized millions through peaceful resistance, who had toppled the British Empire without firing a single shot, only to find himself powerless to stop the violence erupting between Hindus and Muslims as his dream of a united India fractured into two nations, as partition carved the subcontinent into bleeding pieces, as centuries-old neighbours turned on each other with machetes and torches and unspeakable cruelty. Those final 17 days are a microcosm of everything Gandhi believed, everything he fought for, and everything that his newly independent India was struggling to become. They reveal not just how one man died, but how a nation was truly born, not in the moment of a midnight independence on August 15th, 1947, but in the traumatic months that followed, in the million deaths during partition, and ultimately in the gunshots that rang out on January 30th, 1948. So as the evening settles around us like a familiar blanket, as the day's noise fades to a comfortable quiet, let's step back to those final weeks and trace how one man's last days, his final fast, his final prayers, his final steps, became the crucible in which modern India's soul was forged. This is the bedtime biography of Gandhi's last days, and how they changed a nation forever. Part 1, The Weight of Freedom, January 12, 1948. Gandhi sits on the floor of Birla House, his legs folded beneath him in the lotus position he's maintained for decades, though now it causes his aged joints considerable pain. Before him lies a simple meal he hasn't touched: goat's milk, some vegetables, a piece of fruit. Around him gather his closest companions, his grandnieces Abba and Manu, who've become his walking sticks, supporting him as he moves through his daily routines. Pyarelal, his longtime secretary, who records everything, and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, India's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Home Affairs, who's come to plead with the old man to end what he's doing. What Gandhi is doing, as he's done so many times before in his long career, is fasting. Not eating as political theatre, as moral pressure, as the ultimate non-violent weapon. He's been fasting for nearly 5 days now, and his already frail body is beginning to show the strain. His voice, usually strong despite his age, has grown thin and reedy. His eyes, which normally sparkle with mischief and determination, look sunken and dark. But this fast is different from all the others. In the past, Gandhi fasted against the British, to protest unjust laws, to shame colonial authorities, to mobilise Indian resistance. Those fasts had clear targets and clear demands. This time, he's fasting against his own people, against the violence consuming the land he fought his entire life to free. And he's not entirely sure it will work anymore. The India that celebrated independence just 5 months earlier, on that magical midnight when Jawaharlal Nehru declared, "At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom," has descended into a nightmare that Gandhi couldn't have imagined in his darkest moments. The partition, the division of British India into Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan, has unleashed horrors beyond comprehension. Trains arrive at stations in Delhi carrying nothing but corpses. Entire carriages filled with bodies of Muslims killed by Hindu and Sikh mobs as they fled toward Pakistan. Or Hindus and Sikhs slaughtered by Muslim crowds on their desperate journey into India. The railway platforms run with blood. Station workers have to hose down the carriages between arrivals, the water mixing with dried blood running in rivers along the tracks. In villages and cities across North India, neighbours who'd lived together for generations are now attacking each other with whatever weapons they can find. Stories circulate, stories too terrible to fully believe but too widespread to dismiss, of babies thrown into wells, of women raped and mutilated, of entire families burned alive in their homes. The estimates vary, but somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people have died in the partition violence. 10 to 20 million refugees are on the move, the largest forced migration in human history. Gandhi, who had fasted and marched and negotiated and cajoled for Indian independence, now finds that independence has birthed a monster he can't control. The non-violence he preached for decades seems to have evaporated the moment the British left. Hindus blame Muslims for demanding partition and creating Pakistan. Muslims fear for their lives in Hindu-majority India. Sikhs, who've seen their sacred homeland of Punjab divided between India and Pakistan, rage against both. And Gandhi, the Mahatma, the father figure who'd united millions under the banner of ahimsa, non-violence, now watches helplessly as that unity dissolves into sectarian bloodshed. Many Hindus, particularly Hindu nationalists, who'd always viewed Gandhi's message of Hindu-Muslim unity with suspicion, now openly blame him for partition. Gandhi has betrayed Hindus. They whisper in tea shops and on street corners. He gave away Pakistan to Muslims. He's too soft on Muslims. He's a traitor to Hinduism. This accusation wounds Gandhi more deeply than any British prison sentence ever did. He who had devoted his life to the vision of Ram Rajya, the kingdom of God, where all religions would coexist peacefully, is now accused of being anti-Hindu by his own people. Mobs of Hindu refugees from Pakistan, who've lost everything and seen their families murdered, gather outside Birla House shouting slogans against him. The police have to form protective cordons to prevent them from storming the building. It's against this backdrop that Gandhi begins his fast on January 13th, 1948. His demand is simple, yet impossibly ambitious. He will fast until Delhi's atmosphere changes, until Hindu, Muslim and Sikh leaders commit to ending the violence. until refugees are resettled, until Muslims can walk the streets of Delhi without fear. He's essentially asking human nature itself to transform overnight. Patel, the hard-headed realist who spent months dealing with the practical nightmare of partition, organising refugee camps, preventing riots, trying to maintain order, looks at his old friend with a mixture of love and exasperation. Bapu, he says, using the affectionate term meaning father, the situation is beyond anyone's control. Fasting won't stop the violence. These people don't care about your fast. They're too consumed by hatred and revenge. Gandhi's response is characteristic. If my fast has no power to melt hearts, then I have no right to live anyway, he says in that thin, tired voice. If my ahimsa means nothing anymore, if the non-violence I've preached my whole life can't stop this, then what was the point of any of it? There's something almost desperate in Gandhi's fast this time, something that suggests he knows he's fighting a losing battle but can't conceive of any other way to fight. His entire philosophy, his entire life's work, is built on the premise that non-violence is more powerful than violence, that moral force can overcome physical force, that love can conquer hate. But what happens when that premise is tested against the raw, primal violence of communal rage? What happens when centuries of coexistence suddenly collapse into an orgy of killing? The news of Gandhi's fast spreads through Delhi like wildfire. Within hours, people begin gathering outside Birla House. Not just his followers and admirers, but also skeptics and critics. People who want to see if the old man's magic will work one more time. The newspapers run front-page stories with increasingly alarming headlines as Gandhi's health deteriorates, Mahatma's condition critical, Gandhi's fast enters dangerous phase, nation holds its breath. Nehru, now Prime Minister and Gandhi's spiritual heir, rushes to Birla House multiple times a day, his face drawn with worry. The relationship between Nehru and Gandhi has always been complicated. The younger man, educated at Harrow and Cambridge, rationalist and modernist, shaped by his mentor, but also frequently frustrated by what he sees as Gandhi's mysticism and impractical idealism. But there's genuine love between them, and Nehru is terrified that India might lose Gandhi just when the nation needs him most. "You must not die, Bapu," Nehru pleads, his characteristic composure cracking. "India cannot afford to lose you now." But Gandhi remains unmoved. "If India cannot choose peace over violence, then perhaps India doesn't deserve to have me," he responds, though his eyes soften as he looks at his protege. The Muslim community in Delhi, which has been living in terror for months, sees Gandhi's fast as perhaps their last hope. Muslim leaders begin organising peace rallies, urging their communities to prove they can coexist with Hindus. They collect donations to show good faith, offer to help resettle Hindu refugees from Pakistan. At mosques across Delhi, imams pray for Gandhi's health and for communal harmony. Meanwhile, Hindu nationalist groups watch with barely concealed rage. To them, Gandhi's fast is yet another example of him favouring Muslims at Hindus' expense. They see his demand that Muslims be protected and restored to their homes in Delhi as a betrayal when millions of Hindu refugees from Pakistan are living in squalid camps with nowhere to go. Why doesn't he fast for Hindu refugees? They ask. Why is he always concerned about Muslims, but never about Hindus? This tension between Gandhi's universalist vision of religious harmony and the particularist nationalism that sees India as essentially a Hindu nation is the fundamental conflict that will ultimately cost him his life. But we're not there yet. First, There are 10 more days to navigate. 10 more days of a frail old man trying to hold together a fragmenting nation through sheer moral force. By January 15th, Gandhi's fast has entered what his doctors warn is a dangerous phase. His pulse is weak and irregular. His kidneys are showing signs of strain. His blood pressure drops alarmingly. The doctors, Western-trained and sceptical of what they see as emotional blackmail, nonetheless recognise that the 78-year-old man genuinely risks death if he continues. This creates a crisis for India's leadership. If Gandhi dies during the fast, the country might explode into even worse violence. His martyrdom could trigger a catastrophic communal war. But if they cave to his demands and force through commitments that the population isn't ready to accept, they risk appearing weak and losing control of the situation. They're caught between the rock of practical governance and the hard place of Gandhi's moral absolutism. Representatives from Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, and Jewish communities are summoned to Birla House. Gandhi, lying on his simple cot, barely able to lift his head, addresses them in a voice so weak they have to lean close to hear. "Give me a solemn pledge," he whispers. "Promise me that Delhi will become a place where all faiths can live together in peace. Promise me that Muslims will be safe, that their property will be restored, that refugees will be resettled humanely. Promise me that the violence will end." The leaders, faced with the prospect of Gandhi's death on their consciences, make the promises. They sign documents pledging to work for communal harmony, to protect minorities, to end violence. Hindu organisations that have been most critical of Muslims make reluctant commitments. Muslim leaders pledge cooperation and peace. On January 18, 1948, after 6 days of fasting, Gandhi agrees to break his fast with a glass of orange juice. The scene at Birla House is emotional beyond description. Hundreds of people have gathered outside, and when the news spreads that Gandhi will break his fast, a wave of relief and celebration sweeps through the crowd. People weep openly. They chant prayers. They embrace strangers from different religious communities. For a brief, shining moment, it seems like Gandhi's moral magic has worked again, like the power of his sacrifice has melted hearts and transformed minds. But even as he sips that first glass of juice, even as his body begins the slow process of recovery, Gandhi harbours deep doubts. "I wonder," he confides to Manu later that evening, "whether these promises will last longer than my fast, whether people's hearts have truly changed, or whether they've simply been moved by sentiment that will fade when I'm no longer fasting." His doubts prove tragically prescient, because in a house not far away, a small group of men who view Gandhi not as a Mahatma but as a traitor are putting the finishing touches on their plan. They've watched his fast with contempt rather than sympathy. They've seen the pledges of communal harmony as further evidence of his pro-Muslim bias, and they've decided that the only way to save Hinduism and India is to remove Gandhi from the equation permanently. The fast is over, but Gandhi's final journey has only just begun. Part 2. The Walking Corpse. January 20th, 1948. The lawn at Birla House is packed with people for the evening prayer meeting, as it has been every evening for months. It's become a Delhi institution. At 5 p.m. sharp, Gandhi emerges from the house supported by his grandnieces, walks slowly to the prayer ground, and addresses the crowd on topics ranging from scripture to current events, from moral philosophy to practical advice for daily living. Today, 8 days before his death, Gandhi looks particularly frail. The fast has taken a visible toll on his already skeletal frame. He weighs perhaps 90 pounds now. his ribs clearly visible through the thin cotton cloth draped over his torso. His skin, always weathered and brown from years in the Indian sun, now looks almost translucent, papery. When he speaks, his voice is barely audible beyond the first few rows. But his message tonight is characteristic. A call for Hindu-Muslim unity. A reminder that true independence means nothing if it's achieved through violence. A plea for people to embrace the highest teachings of their own faiths rather than their basest instincts. He quotes from the Gita, from the Quran, from the Bible, demonstrating the syncretism that has always defined his approach to religion. What Gandhi doesn't know, what nobody in that peaceful evening gathering knows, is that death has already come calling once. Just the night before, January 19th, a conspiracy to assassinate him was thwarted almost by accident. A crude bomb exploded in the compound of Birla House during the evening prayers, causing panic and minor injuries, but failing in its apparent objective of creating chaos during which Gandhi could be killed. The bomb was planted by members of a Hindu nationalist group who viewed Gandhi as an obstacle to their vision of a purely Hindu India. The explosion investigation led police to several conspirators, but they escaped before they could be fully interrogated. The authorities knew there was a plot against Gandhi's life, but they didn't grasp its full scope or the determination of those involved. When told about the bomb, Gandhi's response is telling and tragic. "If someone wants to kill me," he says calmly, "let them kill me. I will die with God's name on my lips, but I will not live surrounded by bodyguards like a coward. I will not stop my prayer meetings or change my routine because of threats. If I cannot walk freely and speak freely in my own country, then what was the point of winning independence?" It's vintage Gandhi, the absolute refusal to compromise his principles even when faced with mortal danger, the conviction that moral courage matters more than physical safety, the almost fatalistic acceptance of whatever fate God has in store. His colleagues and family are alarmed, but they've learned over decades that arguing with Gandhi when he's made up his mind about a moral principle is like arguing with a mountain about where it should stand. The Indian government, now aware of serious threats against Gandhi, increases security around Birla House despite his objections. Police patrol the perimeter. Plainclothes officers mingle with the crowds at prayer meetings. But Gandhi insists that people be allowed to approach him freely, refuses to have his grandnieces searched or interrogated, continues his routine exactly as before. "If people cannot come close to me," he insists, "then I am already a prisoner rather than free." These final days reveal Gandhi in all his contradictions. He's simultaneously the most powerful figure in India. His word can still move millions. His moral authority exceeds that of any elected official. And completely powerless in the face of communal violence. He can fast and shame leaders into making promises, but he can't enforce those promises or change the hearts of people consumed by hatred. He can preach non-violence until he's hoarse, but he can't stop people from picking up weapons. There's something almost Christ-like about Gandhi in these final days. The sense of a prophet who knows his message is being rejected, who sees the writing on the wall but cannot bring himself to abandon his mission or save himself. He walks through the Birla House gardens like a man already half in the next world, his mind focused on eternal truths, while his body shuffles through daily routines. His prayer meetings during this period take on an increasingly urgent, almost desperate quality. He talks about death frequently, not morbidly, but matter-of-factly, as something that could come at any moment and that he's ready for. "Death is the truest friend I have," he tells the crowd one evening. "It will come when it's meant to come, and when it does, I hope to greet it with a smile, He also becomes more explicitly critical of Hindu nationalism and what he sees as the betrayal of India's pluralistic traditions. This is dangerous territory, speaking against majority sentiments, criticising Hindu practices and attitudes at a time when Hindu-Muslim tensions are at their highest. But Gandhi has never been one to trim his message for political convenience. "Some of you call me Mahatma," he says at one prayer meeting, "but if I am truly a great soul, why can I not stop the killing? Why can people not hear my message of nonviolence? Perhaps I am not a Mahatma at all. Perhaps I am just a stubborn old man who has outlived his usefulness." There's genuine anguish in these words, the anguish of a man confronting the possibility that his entire life's work has failed. 40 years of campaigning for nonviolence, and India greets its independence with the worst communal violence in its history. Decades of preaching Hindu-Muslim unity, and the subcontinent tears itself apart along religious lines. A lifetime devoted to ahimsa, and his own people are murdering each other by the hundreds of thousands. Yet he keeps going. Every morning he rises before dawn for prayers. He reads from the Gita and other scriptures. He maintains his correspondence, writing letters to political leaders, to ordinary citizens, to Muslim refugees fleeing to Pakistan, to Hindu refugees arriving from Pakistan. He meets with an endless stream of visitors, politicians seeking his blessing or advice, refugees seeking comfort, journalists seeking statements, ordinary people seeking darshan, the spiritual benefit that comes from being in the presence of a holy person. Manu and Abha, his constant companions, watch him with growing concern. They can see the toll this is taking, not just physically but spiritually. The man who was always laughing and joking, who found joy even in the midst of struggle, now seems weighed down by an immense sadness. They try to encourage him to rest more, to see fewer people, to take better care of himself. But Gandhi brushes off their concerns with a gentle smile. "What is there to rest for?" he asks. "I will rest when I'm dead. While I'm alive, there's too much work to be done." On January 25th, just 5 days before his death, Gandhi meets with several Hindu leaders who've been vocally critical of him. The meeting is tense. These men represent the hardcore Hindu nationalist position, that India should be a Hindu nation, that Muslims should either convert or leave, that Gandhi's insistence on protecting Muslims is a betrayal of Hindu interests. Gandhi listens patiently to their grievances, then responds with a directness that surprises them. "If you believe India belongs only to Hindus," he says, "then you have understood nothing about Hinduism. The Gita teaches that all beings are manifestations of the divine. How can we claim to follow Hindu Dharma while murdering our Muslim neighbours?" The meeting ends without resolution, with both sides more convinced than ever of their positions. As the visitors leave, one of them mutters just loudly enough for others to hear. The old man has gone senile. He's lost touch with reality. Someone needs to save India from his madness. These words reach Gandhi's ears. His response is typically Gandhi. "Perhaps they're right. Perhaps I am mad. But I would rather be mad with love than sane with hatred." The conspiracy against his life is now in its final stages, though Gandhi doesn't know this. The men who planted the bomb on January 19 haven't given up. They've merely regrouped. They're watching his routines, noting his refusal of security, waiting for their moment. They've obtained a proper weapon this time, not a crude homemade bomb, but a Beretta pistol. And they've identified their assassin, a man convinced he's performing a sacred duty, that he's saving Hinduism itself. Meanwhile, India's political leadership is preoccupied with other crises. There's the ongoing challenge of integrating hundreds of princely states into the new nation. There's the dispute with Pakistan over Kashmir, which will eventually lead to war. There's the massive task of drafting a constitution for a nation of 300 million people. Gandhi's security, while theoretically important, doesn't seem as urgent as these other matters. Nehru visits Gandhi on January 28th, 2 days before the assassination. They have a long conversation about India's future, about the constitution being drafted, about whether India should remain in the British Commonwealth. Gandhi expresses his doubts about many of Nehru's modernising plans. The emphasis on heavy industry, the creation of a powerful centralised state, the adoption of Western models of development. I fear, Gandhi tells Nehru, that we're simply replacing British rule with brown British rule. That we're adopting all the structures of the colonial state while changing nothing fundamental. That we're building an India I don't recognise. Nehru, frustrated, responds, "But Bapu, we can't run a modern nation according to village principles. We need industry, we need infrastructure, we need centralised planning. Your vision of a return to village life is beautiful but impractical." It's an old argument between them, one they've had many times. But there's something final about this conversation, though neither realises it at the time. Gandhi is essentially saying goodbye to his vision of what India could have been. A decentralised nation of self-sufficient villages, living simply, embracing non-violence, transcending religious divisions. Nehru is explaining the India that will actually emerge. Industrial, modern, secular, but not always living up to its secular ideals. Powerful but also deeply divided. As Nehru prepares to leave, Gandhi grasps his hand. "Whatever happens," he says, "remember that violence never solves anything. Promise me that you'll always choose dialogue over force, peace over war." Nehru promises, though he'll break this promise within a year when India and Pakistan go to war over Kashmir. On January 29th, the day before his death, Gandhi seems particularly at peace. His health has stabilised somewhat after the fast. The weather is pleasant, cool but sunny, perfect Delhi winter weather. He takes his usual morning walk in the gardens, tends to his correspondence, meets with various visitors. He even makes jokes, something he hasn't done much lately, teasing Manu about a boy who's been showing interest in her. That evening's prayer meeting is well attended, as always. Gandhi speaks about the need for communal harmony, about the importance of treating all people as children of God, regardless of their religion. His voice is stronger than it's been in days. People in the crowd remark on how good he looks, how the fast seems to have renewed rather than depleted him. After the meeting, as he's walking back to the house, a young man approaches him with what appears to be a petition or letter. Gandhi stops, as he always does for anyone who wants to speak to him. The young man bows reverently, touches Gandhi's feet in the traditional gesture of respect. Gandhi blesses him with a smile. The young man's name is Nathuram Godse, and he's there to scout out the exact layout of the prayer ground to confirm his plan for the following day. He walks away convinced that his cause is righteous, that he's about to commit an act of patriotic heroism rather than murder. He spends the evening in prayer, asking for divine guidance and strength for what he's about to do. That night, Gandhi goes to bed around 9 p.m, his usual time. His last words before sleeping, according to Manu's diary, are about a passage from the Gita. The truly wise person treats pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat as the same. Such a person never sins. He sleeps peacefully, unaware that he has just 18 hours left to live. Part 3, 17 minutes past 5, January the 30th, 1948, the morning dawns clear and cool. Another beautiful Delhi winter day. Gandhi rises at 3:30 a.m, as he's done every day for decades. His first act, as always, is prayer. Recitations from the Gita and other sacred texts, meditation in the pre-dawn darkness. There's something deeply peaceful about these hours before sunrise, when the city is still asleep and he can commune with God without interruption. By 4:30 a.m, he's attending to correspondence. There are always letters to write, to political leaders, to followers, to ordinary citizens who've written him seeking advice. His handwriting is shaky now, the letters large and uneven, betraying his age and infirmity. But he persists, determined to respond personally to as many people as possible. Around 7 a.m, he takes a massage, a daily ritual meant to help with his circulation and chronic pain. The masseur, who's been serving him for years, notices nothing unusual about Gandhi's mood or demeanour. If anything, he seems more relaxed than he's been in months, almost serene. Breakfast is simple, as always. Goat's milk, some boiled vegetables, fruit. Gandhi eats slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly, as he's long preached people should do for proper digestion. Manu and Abba sit with him, and they chat about mundane things. The weather, plans for the coming weeks, letters that need responding to. Mid-morning brings the usual stream of visitors. Politicians seeking his advice on various issues. Refugees asking for help. Journalists wanting statements. Gandhi receives them all patiently, though it's clear he's tiring. By noon, Abba suggests he rest, and for once he agrees without argument. He naps for about an hour, a light sleep from which he wakes easily when someone enters the room. Upon waking, he immediately asks what time it is. 2 o'clock, Bapu, Manu tells him. Good, he responds. I was worried I'd sleep through the afternoon. The afternoon is spent in more meetings, more correspondence. Around 4 p.m, he reminds Manu and Abba that the evening prayer meeting is at 5 p.m, and he doesn't want to be late. Punctuality is something Gandhi takes seriously. He believes being late shows disrespect for other people's time. But today, he's running behind. A meeting with Patel goes longer than expected, with the two men discussing the ongoing crisis over Kashmir and how to prevent full-scale war with Pakistan. When Patel finally leaves, it's already 5:10 p.m. Gandhi is clearly agitated about the delay. I'm late, he says, moving toward the door. The people will be waiting. We must hurry. Abha and Manu take their positions on either side of him, becoming his human walking sticks. Pyarelal, his secretary, notes the time precisely, 5:12 p.m, as they leave the house. Gandhi walks quickly despite his age and frailty, propelled by his annoyance at being late and his desire not to keep the crowd waiting. The prayer ground is about 200 yards from the main house, along a paved path through the gardens. It's a walk Gandhi has made hundreds of times over the past months. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across the lawn. The air smells of jasmine and marigolds. Birds chatter in the trees. Everything is ordinary, peaceful, exactly as it should be. The crowd at the prayer ground has been waiting for about 10 minutes. There are roughly 500 people gathered, a mix of ages, religions, social classes. Some are regular attendees who come every day. Others are visitors, tourists, the curious. A few are refugees, people who've lost everything and come to hear the Mahatma's words of comfort and hope. As Gandhi comes into view, supported by his grandnieces, the crowd parts naturally to create a path. People fold their hands in namaste, bow their heads respectfully. Gandhi returns their greetings with his characteristic gesture, palms pressed together, A slight bow, a gentle smile. He's in no hurry now, taking time to acknowledge individuals in the crowd. This is when Nathuram Gods makes his move. He's been standing in the crowd for about 20 minutes, his right hand in his pocket clutching the Beretta M1934 pistol. He's dressed in khaki, looking like any other middle-class Hindu man in the crowd. Nothing about him draws particular attention. As Gandhi approaches, Godse steps forward from the crowd. He joins his palms in a respectful namaste. He bows low, as if to touch Gandhi's feet in the traditional gesture of reverence. Gandhi, always receptive to such approaches, stops and prepares to bless this devotee. What happens next unfolds in less than 3 seconds, but will be described, analysed, and debated for decades. Godse straightens up quickly. He pulls the pistol from his pocket. He fires 3 times at point-blank range, the report sharp and shocking in the peaceful garden air. The first bullet strikes Gandhi in the chest. The second hits his abdomen. The third, fired as Gandhi is already falling, hits his chest again. Gandhi's last words, as recounted by dozens of witnesses, are "Hey Ram, O God," or more literally, "O Rama," invoking the Hindu deity. Whether this is true, or whether it's been embellished by those who want his last words to be appropriately devotional, and Hindu is debated to this day. But the witnesses closest to him, Manu, Abba, several others within arm's reach, all agree that he said something that sounded like Ram as he fell. He collapses into Manu and Abba's arms, blood spreading rapidly across his white cloth. His eyes remain open but unfocused. For a moment there's absolute silence, as if the entire crowd has inhaled simultaneously and frozen, unable to believe what they have just witnessed. Then chaos erupts, screams, shouts, people surge forward. Godse, curiously, makes no attempt to escape. He stands there, gun still in hand, seemingly in shock at what he's done, or perhaps waiting to be martyred himself. Several men in the crowd grab him, wrestling him to the ground, though some testimony suggests he surrendered willingly. "I've killed Gandhi!" Godse shouts as he's being restrained. "I've killed the enemy of Hindus! I've saved India!" The words are chilling in their conviction, the tone not of a madman, but of someone utterly certain of his righteousness. Meanwhile, Gandhi is dying. Manu and Abba, along with others who've rushed forward, carry his limp body the few yards back toward Birla House. He's already unconscious, his breathing shallow and laboured. The blood loss is massive, 3 bullets from close range, any one of which would likely be fatal. They carry him to a room in Birla House and lay him on a cot. A doctor arrives within minutes, but immediately recognises there's nothing to be done. The wounds are too severe, the blood loss too great. For a man of 78, already weakened by recent fasting, recovery is impossible. Gandhi dies at approximately 5:30 p.m, just 13 minutes after being shot. His last conscious moments are surrounded by the people he loved, his grandnieces, his secretary, close associates who've rushed to his side. Outside, the crowd at the prayer ground remains, some praying, some weeping, most simply stunned into silence. The news spreads through Delhi like lightning, carried by telephone calls, radio broadcasts, word of mouth. Gandhi has been shot. Gandhi is dead. The Mahatma is no more. Within an hour, thousands of people surround Birla House. By evening, tens of thousands. By the next morning, hundreds of thousands. Nehru, when he receives the news, is at a government reception. He goes immediately to Birla House, arriving to find Gandhi's body already prepared for viewing, according to Hindu custom. Nehru, the rational modernist who never quite embraced Gandhi's mysticism, who often found his mentor's religiosity and traditionalism frustrating, breaks down completely. He throws himself across Gandhi's body, sobbing uncontrollably, calling out "Bapu, Bapu" over and over. It falls to Nehru to address the nation. At 9:15 p.m. that night, he speaks on All India Radio in a broadcast that will become one of the most famous speeches in Indian history. Friends and comrades, the light has gone out of our lives and there is darkness everywhere. I do not know what to tell you and how to say it. Our beloved leader, Bapu, as we called him, the father of the nation, is no more. Perhaps I am wrong to say that. Nevertheless, we will not see him again as we have seen him for these many years. We will not run to him for advice and seek solace from him, and that is a terrible blow, not to me only, but to millions and millions in this country. His voice breaks repeatedly as he speaks. The usually composed, articulate Nehru struggles to maintain his composure. You can hear the grief in every word, the sense of a son who has lost his father, of a nation that has lost its moral centre. The light has gone out, I said. Nehru continues. And yet I was wrong. For the light that shone in this country was no ordinary light. The light that has illumined this country for these many years will illumine this country for many more years. And 1,000 years later, that light will still be seen in this country, and the world will see it, and it will give solace to innumerable hearts. It's a beautiful speech, made more powerful by Nehru's obvious emotion, by the rawness of the moment. As he speaks, millions of Indians listen on radios across the country, and they begin to grasp the magnitude of what has happened. Gandhi is dead, killed not by the British he fought for 40 years, not by a foreign enemy, but by one of his own countrymen. Killed not for opposing India, but for loving it too much and too inclusively. Killed not for his failures, but for his vision. Part 4. That the nation holds its breath. The hours immediately following Gandhi's assassination are perhaps the most dangerous in independent India's short history. The new nation, barely 5 months old, faces the very real possibility of complete disintegration into communal warfare that could make partition violence look mild by comparison. The situation is explosive. Hindu nationalist groups have been openly critical of Gandhi for months, accusing him of being pro-Muslim. Now one of their own has assassinated him. The Muslim community, already terrorized and vulnerable, fears massive retribution. Militant Hindus, angry at Gandhi's death, could turn their rage on Muslims. Or Hindu nationalists, emboldened by successfully eliminating their enemy, could launch a broader campaign of violence. Everything hangs in the balance during those first few hours. India could become another Yugoslavia, another Rwanda, and a nation that tears itself apart along religious lines in an orgy of revenge killing. The machinery of communal violence, once fully unleashed, is nearly impossible to stop. But something remarkable happens instead. Something that validates, in the strangest and most tragic way, everything Gandhi lived and died for. Within hours of Gandhi's death, Hindu leaders, even those who had been critical of him, rushed to radio stations and public squares to condemn the assassination and call for calm. The RSS, Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, a Hindu nationalist organisation that had been deeply critical of Gandhi, issues statements mourning his death and urging its members to maintain peace. More importantly, ordinary Hindus, even those who had felt betrayed by Gandhi's defence of Muslims, recognise that his assassination crosses a fundamental line. The murder transforms Gandhi in the public imagination from a flawed political figure who'd made questionable decisions into a martyr, a secular saint who'd been murdered for preaching love and tolerance. The government moves quickly to contain potential violence. Patel as Home Minister, orders police and military units onto high alert. Hindu nationalist organisations suspected of involvement in the conspiracy are raided and banned. The RSS, though not directly implicated in the assassination, is shut down for nearly 2 years. Leaders who had been openly hostile to Gandhi are arrested or questioned. But the real miracle is that ordinary Indians, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, respond to Gandhi's death not with violence but with grief. Millions pour into the streets not to riot but to mourn. The tears are genuine, the sorrow palpable. Even those who'd criticised Gandhi in life find themselves overcome with emotion at his death. By midnight on January 30th, the streets of Delhi are filled with people, but they're not fighting. They're walking toward Birla House, carrying candles and flowers, singing devotional songs and nationalist anthems. Hindus and Muslims walk side by side. Sikhs join Parsis, join Christians in collective mourning. It's exactly the kind of communal unity Gandhi had preached his entire life, achieved through the ultimate sacrifice. At Birla House, Gandhi's body has been moved to a larger room where it can be properly prepared and displayed. According to Hindu custom, the body should be cremated quickly, ideally within 24 hours. But the government recognises that the nation needs time to pay its respects, to process what has happened. Through the night of January 30th, 31, a constant stream of people files passed Gandhi's body. They've dressed him in fresh white cloth. His face, in death, looks peaceful, almost serene. The violence of his death isn't visible. The blood has been cleaned away. The bullet wounds hidden. He could be sleeping. Nehru remains at Birla House most of the night, receiving dignitaries, consoling Gandhi's family members, coordinating with officials. He's still in shock, moving through the motions of leadership, but clearly devastated. At one point, overcome with emotion again, he has to step outside into the garden where Gandhi took his last walk just hours earlier. How do we go on without him? Nehru asks Patel, the only person present who's known Gandhi as long as he has. Patel, the tough administrator who rarely shows emotion, has tears streaming down his face. We do what he would have wanted, Patel responds. We build the India he dreamed of. We prove that his death wasn't in vain. By dawn on January 31st, estimates suggest that over 1 million people have gathered in and around Birla House. The crowd extends for miles in every direction. People stand in complete silence or in prayer. The normal sounds of the city, traffic, vendors, daily life, have been replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by prayers and occasional sobbing. The government has to make rapid decisions about the funeral arrangements. Where will they hold it? How will they manage the crowds? How do they give the nation time to mourn while also preventing the situation from becoming dangerous? They decide on a funeral procession through Delhi to the banks of the Yamuna River, where Gandhi will be cremated according to Hindu rites. The procession is scheduled for the afternoon of January 31st, less than 24 hours after his death, but enough time for people to gather and for the world to take notice. The funeral procession becomes one of the most remarkable events in modern history. Gandhi's body is placed on a weapons carrier, a military truck that will serve as his funeral bier. The truck is decorated with flowers, jasmine, marigolds, roses, until you can barely see the metal beneath. Gandhi's body lies atop this flower-covered vehicle, visible to all. The procession route is 5.5 miles from Birla House to Rajghat on the banks of the Yamuna River. Along this route, an estimated 2 million people have gathered. The crowds are so dense that in many places the procession can barely move. People throw flowers. They chant prayers. They reach out to touch the vehicle carrying Gandhi's body, as if even in death he can bestow blessings. Walking directly behind the weapons carrier are Gandhi's family members, his sons, his grandchildren, his grandnieces. Then comes Nehru, walking with Patel and other government leaders. Behind them, dignitaries from around the world, diplomats, religious leaders, journalists, and behind them, the people. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary Indians walking slowly through Delhi's streets, following their Bapu on his final journey. The procession takes over 5 hours to cover 5.5 miles. At times it comes to a complete stop, the crowd too dense to move through. Military units try to maintain order, but they're overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. At several points, the crowd surges forward so forcefully that people are nearly crushed, and soldiers have to form human chains to prevent disasters. What's remarkable about the crowd is its composition. Rich and poor, Brahmins and Dalits, Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and Christians, all walking together. Cabinet ministers walk alongside street sweepers. Aristocrats alongside farmers. It's the India Gandhi dreamed of, temporarily realised, collective grief. International journalists covering the event are stunned by the scale and emotion. Margaret Bourke-White, the famous Life magazine photographer, captures iconic images of the procession. The flower-covered weapons carrier, Nehru's grief-stricken face, the sea of humanity stretching to the horizon. These images will go around the world, making Gandhi's assassination front-page news from New York to London to Tokyo. As the procession finally reaches Rajghat, around 4 p.m., the actual cremation presents another challenge. Hindu custom requires that the eldest son light the funeral pyre. Gandhi's eldest surviving son, Ramdas, is present and prepared to perform this duty, but the crowd is so dense, so emotional, that there are real fears of chaos. A funeral pyre has been built on a raised platform, sandalwood logs stacked in the traditional manner, prepared with ghee and other materials that will help the body burn. Gandhi's body is placed on the pyre, still covered in flowers, still looking peaceful. Ramdas, his hand shaking visibly, approaches the pyre with the torch. The crowd, which has been noisy and restless, suddenly falls completely silent. You could hear a pin drop across that vast gathering. Ramdas lights the pyre. The flames catch quickly, the sandalwood beginning to burn with fragrant smoke. As the flames rise, the crowd releases a collective cry, part prayer, part lament, part anguish. People throw more flowers into the flames. They call out, "Mahatma Gandhi, ki jai, victory, to Mahatma Gandhi." They sing his favourite devotional songs, particularly Raghupati Raghav Rajaram, the bhajan that opened all his prayer meetings. The cremation takes several hours. Hindu custom requires that the body burn completely, reducing to ash and bone fragments. As evening falls and the pyre burns, people begin to disperse slowly, but thousands remain through the night, maintaining vigil. For 13 days following the cremation, India observes official mourning. Government offices close, businesses shutter, public entertainment is cancelled. It's as if the entire nation has hit pause, needing time to process what has happened. During these 13 days, something fundamental shifts in how Indians think about Gandhi and about themselves. The man who in life had been controversial, criticised, even hated by significant segments of the population, becomes in death a unifying national symbol. His flaws are forgotten or forgiven. His vision of a non-violent, religiously tolerant India becomes the official national aspiration, even if reality often falls short. The transformation is particularly notable among those who'd been most critical of him. Hindu nationalists, who'd viewed him as pro-Muslim and blamed him for partition, now find themselves unable to publicly maintain that critique. To speak ill of Gandhi after his assassination is to align oneself with the assassin, to mark oneself as outside the acceptable boundaries of Indian nationalism. This has profound effects on Indian politics for decades. Hindu nationalism doesn't disappear. It goes underground, adapts its message, learns to be more subtle. But it loses its most explicit voice, its ability to openly advocate for India as exclusively a Hindu nation. The RSS remains banned until 1949, and when it's allowed to operate again, it has to explicitly disavow violence and accept the constitutional framework of a secular state. The Congress Party, which had always been Gandhi's political home, even when he wasn't formally a member, appropriates his legacy completely. Nehru and subsequent Congress leaders wrapped themselves in Gandhi's symbolic mantle, claiming to represent his vision even as their policies, emphasizing industrialization, central planning and state power, often directly contradict what Gandhi actually believed. The Gandhi who emerges from those 13 days of mourning is already being transformed into myth, into a figure larger than life, simplified and sanitized. The complex, sometimes contradictory man, who could be petty and stubborn, who had blind spots about race and caste, who was probably emotionally abusive to his wife and sons, disappears behind the image of the perfect Mahatma. On the 13th day, February 12, 1948, a final ceremony is held at Rajghat. Gandhi's ashes and bone fragments, collected after the cremation, are to be immersed in rivers across India, according to Hindu tradition. Some will go into the Ganges at the holy city of Allahabad, others to the Yamuna in Delhi, still others to sacred rivers across the country. But the most significant immersion happens at the confluence of the Ganges and Yamuna at Allahabad, the Triveni Sangam, one of Hinduism's holiest sites. Nehru himself accompanies the ashes there, travelling by train with Gandhi's family members and close associates. When Nehru pours the ashes into the sacred waters, witnesses report that he breaks down again, sobbing like a child. The man who had to be strong for the nation, who had to project leadership and control during the crisis, finally allows himself to fully grieve. "The light has gone out," he repeats, echoing his radio address. But then, looking at the vast crowd gathered at the riverbank, at the millions who've mourned Gandhi, at the nation that's held together despite everything, he adds, "Yet perhaps he would be pleased. Look at what we've become in his absence. Look at how we've chosen unity over division, peace over revenge. Perhaps his death has taught us what his life could not." It's a profound and tragic thought, that sometimes the ultimate sacrifice is necessary, that martyrdom can achieve what years of teaching cannot, that Gandhi's death might have saved India in a way his life couldn't quite manage. Part 5. The Trial and its Aftermath. While the nation mourned, the machinery of justice had to move forward. Nathuram Godse and his co-conspirators for the investigation quickly revealed this wasn't a lone wolf attack, but a coordinated conspiracy, were in custody and would have to face trial. The investigation uncovered a plot involving at least 8 people. Godse was the trigger man, but behind him stood Narayan Apte, his close friend and co-conspirator who'd helped plan the assassination. Behind them stood Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, a Hindu nationalist ideologue who'd inspired the plot, even if his direct involvement couldn't be proven in court. And around them, a network of Hindu nationalist activists who'd provided support, weapons, and encouragement. The trial began in May 1948 and immediately became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in Indian history. The government's challenge was to conduct a fair trial, giving the accused their full legal rights, allowing them to present their defence, while also ensuring that the trial didn't become a platform for Hindu nationalist propaganda. Godse made the government's job both easier and harder by refusing to deny what he'd done. He freely admitted to shooting Gandhi. He showed no remorse. In fact, he was proud of his action, convinced he'd performed a patriotic duty. The question was never whether he'd killed Gandhi, but whether the court would accept his justifications. Indian law at the time didn't allow cameras in the courtroom, but every word of the trial was transcribed and reported in newspapers across the country and around the world. Godse's statement in his own defence, delivered over several days, became particularly notorious, a lengthy defence of Hindu nationalism and an indictment of Gandhi's policies. "I do not desire any mercy to be shown to me," Godse declared from the dock. "I did fire shots at Gandhiji in open daylight, and I did not make any attempt to run away. I surrendered myself and my pistol to the police. I stated all this in my written statement before the police. There is no scope for anyone now to say that I was a tool in the hands of others. It was I who made Apter conceive this idea, and I invited other persons to help me in the plan." He then launched into an extended justification of his actions. According to Godse, Gandhi had betrayed Hindu interests throughout his political career. He'd been too sympathetic to Muslims. He'd agreed to partition, which resulted in the vivisection of Mother India. He'd insisted that India pay Pakistan 550 million rupees that were owed under the partition agreement, even though Pakistan was at war with India over Kashmir. He'd undertaken his final fast to pressure the Indian government to protect Muslim interests rather than Hindu interests. "I thought to myself and foresaw I shall be totally ruined," Godse stated, "and the only thing I could expect from the people would be nothing but hatred, and that I shall have lost all my honour, even more valuable than my life, if I were to kill Gandhiji." But at the same time, I felt that Indian politics in the absence of Gandhiji would surely be practical, able to retaliate, and would be powerful with armed forces. No doubt, my own future would be totally ruined, but the nation would be saved from the inroads of Pakistan. It's a chilling statement, revealing a man who saw himself as a patriotic hero making the ultimate sacrifice for his nation. He believed he was saving India, even if it meant sacrificing his own life and reputation. He fully expected to be executed and welcomed it as martyrdom. The prosecution, led by C.K. Daftery, didn't have to work hard to prove guilt. Godse had admitted everything. Instead, their job was to ensure that Godse's lengthy self-justification didn't gain traction, didn't transform him into a sympathetic figure or a patriotic hero in the public imagination. The defence attorneys, court-appointed since Godse couldn't afford his own representation, were in an impossible position. They had to provide a vigorous defence while not appearing to endorse political assassination. They argued that Godse had acted from genuine political conviction rather than personal malice, that he believed he was serving India's interests, that his intentions were patriotic even if his actions were criminal. But the evidence was overwhelming and the defendant's own statements damning. On November 8th, 1948, after months of testimony and arguments, the court delivered its verdict. Godse and Apte were found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Several other conspirators received life sentences. The verdict was widely expected, but it still sent shockwaves through certain segments of Hindu nationalist circles. To them, Godse wasn't a murderer, but a hero who'd been railroaded by a government more concerned with appeasing Muslims than defending Hindu interests. They saw his trial and conviction as yet another example of the post-independence government betraying Hindu values. This underground current of sympathy for Godse, never mainstream, always controversial, but persistent, would continue for decades. Godse's statement in his own defence would be published and circulated in Hindu nationalist circles as a kind of alternate narrative of Indian independence. Websites would emerge celebrating him as a patriot. In the 21st century, some fringe Hindu nationalist groups would even attempt to build temples to Godse, to celebrate him as a martyr rather than condemn him as an assassin. But in 1948-49, the overwhelming public sentiment supported the death penalty. Gandhi's assassination was still too fresh, the potential for communal violence still too real. The government needed to send a clear message that political violence would not be tolerated, that religious extremism of any kind, Hindu, Muslim, or otherwise, had no place in independent India. Appeals were filed and rejected. Godse and Apte remained in prison for over a year while the legal process ran its course. During this time, they were kept separate from other prisoners, partly for their own safety. Many inmates would have gladly killed Gandhi's assassins, and partly to prevent them from spreading their ideology. There were calls for clemency, particularly from some of Gandhi's own followers, who argued that Gandhi himself would have opposed the death penalty, that executing his assassin contradicted the principles of nonviolence Gandhi had lived by. But Nehru and the government rejected these appeals. Some crimes, they argued, were too serious to forgive, some actions too dangerous to let unpunished. On November 15, 1949, nearly 2 years after Gandhi's assassination, Nathuram Godse and Narayan Apte were hanged in Ambala jail. They reportedly went to the gallows singing patriotic songs, convinced to the end that they'd acted righteously. Their bodies were cremated and the ashes scattered secretly to prevent their graves from becoming shrines for Hindu extremists. Godse's brother later claimed that Nathuram's last words were Akhand Bharat, undivided India, a reference to his belief that partition had been a mistake, and India and Pakistan should have remained one nation. Whether this is true or apocryphal is unclear, but it captures Godse's worldview, a violent nationalism that saw any compromise, any accommodation of religious minorities, as weakness and betrayal. The execution was supposed to be the end of the story, the final chapter on a dark episode in Indian history. Gandhi was dead, his assassin had been brought to justice and executed, and India could move forward. But of course, history is never that simple. Part 6. The India that emerged. In the years following Gandhi's assassination, India had to answer a fundamental question. What kind of nation would it become? Would it embrace Gandhi's vision of non-violence, religious tolerance, and village-based development? Or would it follow a different path, one more aligned with Nehru's modernist, industrialist vision? Or perhaps something else entirely? The answer, like most things in India, was complicated. The constitution that was finalised in 1950, 2 years after Gandhi's death, enshrined many of his values in theory, while often contradicting them in practice. It established India as a secular republic, guaranteeing freedom of religion and prohibiting discrimination based on religion, caste, or gender. It abolished untouchability and outlawed caste-based discrimination. These were all principles Gandhi had fought for throughout his life. But the constitution also created a powerful centralised state with a strong military, embraced industrialisation and modern development, and established a parliamentary democracy based on Western models. all things Gandhi had been sceptical about. The India of the Constitution was Nehru's India more than Gandhi's, though it wrapped itself in Gandhi's symbolic cloak. Gandhi's assassination had a profound effect on how religious nationalism was treated in post-independence India. The RSS and a similar Hindu nationalist organisations were viewed with deep suspicion by the government and mainstream society for decades. They were seen as having created the ideological climate that led to Gandhi's murder, even if their direct involvement couldn't be proven. This pushed Hindu nationalism to the margins of Indian politics for nearly 40 years. The Congress Party dominated Indian politics, and its official ideology was Nehruvian secular nationalism combined with socialism. Gandhi was venerated as the father of the nation, and his birthday became a national holiday. His image appeared on currency. His autobiography was required reading in schools. Cities and streets were renamed in his honour. But this official veneration often felt hollow, divorced from Gandhi's actual teachings. India developed nuclear weapons, something Gandhi would have opposed. It fought multiple wars with Pakistan and China, something Gandhi would have deplored. It embraced industrial capitalism and then later market reforms, directly contradicting Gandhi's vision of village-based economic self-sufficiency. The gap between the mythologized Gandhi and the actual implementation of his ideas created a kind of cognitive dissonance in Indian public life. Everyone claimed to revere Gandhi, but almost nobody was actually following his teachings. His image became a kind of wallpaper, omnipresent but no longer really seen, let alone heeded. The Muslim community in India faced a particularly complicated situation after Gandhi's assassination. On one hand, his death had likely prevented massive anti-Muslim violence in the immediate aftermath. His martyrdom had shocked Hindus into recognizing the dangers of communal hatred. On the other hand, Muslims now lived without their most powerful protector, without the one leader who could speak for them in Hindu-majority India and be heard. Nehru did his best to continue Gandhi's legacy of religious tolerance and protect minority rights. He faced down Hindu nationalists in his own party, insisted on India remaining secular, appointed Muslims to prominent positions. But without Gandhi's moral authority, without his ability to fast unto death, and thereby compel action, Nehru's efforts were less effective. Over the decades, as living memory of Gandhi and Partition faded, as India grappled with poverty, corruption, and the challenges of development, the ideological battles Gandhi's death had temporarily settled began to resurface. Hindu nationalism didn't disappear. It adapted, evolved, waited for its moment. That moment came gradually, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating in the 1990s. The BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, the political descendant of Hindu nationalist organisations, began winning elections, first at state levels and eventually nationally. Their vision of India as fundamentally a Hindu nation where minorities could stay but should know their place was precisely what Gandhi had opposed and what his assassination had temporarily discredited. The supreme irony is that modern Hindu nationalists often claim Gandhi's legacy even as they advocate for policies he opposed. They call him the father of the nation while promoting the same kind of religious nationalism that led to his assassination. They place flowers at his memorial at Raj Ghat, while pursuing a vision of India that would have horrified him. Meanwhile, Gandhi's actual principles, nonviolence, religious tolerance, simple living, decentralized governance, economic self-sufficiency, remain largely unrealized in modern India. The nation has nuclear weapons and a space program massive wealth inequality, recurring communal violence, and a centralised state. It's everything Gandhi didn't want India to become, wrapped in his symbolic legacy. But perhaps that's unfair. Perhaps any nation of 1.4 billion people, with hundreds of languages and multiple religions, trying to develop economically while maintaining democracy, was always going to struggle to live up to any one person's vision, even Gandhi's. The real question is what Gandhi would have made of modern India. Would he see it as a betrayal of everything he fought for? Or would he recognise that nation building is messy and compromised, that reality never matches ideals, that the journey is more important than the destination? We'll never know, of course. Gandhi died believing he'd failed, that his life's work of promoting Hindu-Muslim unity and non-violence had come to nothing, that partition and communal violence had made a mockery of everything he'd taught. He couldn't see that his death would have the impact his life hadn't quite achieved, that his assassination would shock India into recognising the dangers of religious extremism, that his memory would help hold the nation together through its most difficult early years. Part 7. The global echo Gandhi's assassination sent shockwaves far beyond India's borders. Around the world, people who had followed his campaign against British colonialism, who'd been inspired by his philosophy of non-violent resistance, struggled to make sense of his death. In the United States, African-American newspapers ran front-page stories on Gandhi's assassination. For black Americans fighting segregation and discrimination, Gandhi had been an important symbol. Proof that non-violent resistance could defeat entrenched power structures. His death raised troubling questions about whether non-violence was really enough, whether it could protect its practitioners from violence. A young Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr., then just 19 years old, and a student at Morehouse College, read about Gandhi's assassination with deep concern. King was already interested in Gandhi's philosophy and would later travel to India to learn more. Gandhi's death taught King a crucial lesson, that even martyrdom could be politically powerful, that dying for one's principles might accomplish what living for them couldn't. King would later write, "If humanity is to progress, Gandhi is inescapable. He lived, fought and acted, inspired by the vision of humanity evolving toward a world of peace and harmony. We may ignore Gandhi at our own risk." King's own assassination 20 years later, in 1968, would eerily echo Gandhi's, a prophet of non-violence killed by those who rejected his message, his death accomplishing politically what his life had struggled to achieve. In South Africa, where Gandhi had spent 21 years developing his philosophy and tactics of non-violent resistance, his assassination was particularly shocking. Many black South Africans saw Gandhi as a founding figure of their own resistance movement. Nelson Mandela, then 30 years old and becoming active in the African National Congress, studied Gandhi's methods carefully. Mandela would spend decades trying to follow Gandhi's path of non-violent resistance before reluctantly concluding that armed struggle was necessary against the apartheid regime. In Latin America, Gandhi's assassination resonated with liberation theology movements and peasant organisers. His vision of empowering the poor through non-violent collective action inspired numerous movements across the continent. Cesar Chavez, who would later organise farm workers in California, studied Gandhi's methods extensively and adopted many of his tactics: fasting, mass marches, appeals to moral conscience. In Europe, still recovering from World War II, Gandhi's death prompted renewed interest in pacifism and non-violent resistance. His assassination by a religious extremist seemed to validate concerns about the dangers of nationalism and religious fundamentalism. Precisely the forces that had just plunged Europe into devastating war, the Vatican, which had had a complicated relationship with Gandhi during his life, respecting his moral witness but troubled by his Hinduism, and his criticism of Christian missionaries, issued statements of mourning. Pope Pius called Gandhi an apostle of peace, and noted that his assassination was a tragedy not just for India, but for all humanity. British reactions were particularly complex. The empire that Gandhi had fought for 40 years found itself in the awkward position of mourning the man who had helped destroy it. Churchill, who had called Gandhi a half-naked fakir during the independence struggle, and proposed letting him die during his 1943 fast, remained silent. But many other British leaders praised Gandhi and expressed shock at his assassination. Lord Mountbatten, who'd been the last Viceroy of India and had worked closely with Gandhi during the transition to independence, called his death a calamity for all mankind. Mountbatten had developed genuine respect for Gandhi despite their occasional disagreements, and he understood that Gandhi's death created enormous problems for the fragile new Indian state. The British press, which had often mocked Gandhi during the independence struggle, now lionised him in death. The Times of London ran lengthy obituaries praising his moral courage and political genius. The Economist compared him to Jesus Christ and Buddha, calling him one of history's great moral teachers. It was the kind of posthumous rehabilitation that often happens with controversial figures. In death, they become safer to praise. In the United Nations, just 3 years old and still finding its footing, delegates held a moment of silence for Gandhi. The United Nations flag flew at half-mast. Representatives from dozens of countries delivered tributes. There was serious discussion about awarding Gandhi a posthumous Nobel Peace Prize, though the Nobel Committee doesn't award prizes posthumously. The fact that Gandhi had never won the Nobel Peace Prize during his life, despite being nominated 5 times, became a source of embarrassment for the Nobel Committee. Years later, when the Dalai Lama won the Peace Prize, the committee chairman's speech explicitly referenced the regret that Gandhi had never received the award, calling it the greatest omission in our 106-year history. In the Soviet Union, the response was more complicated. Stalin's government had viewed Gandhi with suspicion during his lifetime, seeing his non-violence as bourgeois pacifism that prevented proper revolutionary action. Soviet propaganda had often portrayed him as a tool of British imperialism or of Indian capitalists. But after his assassination, even Soviet media had to acknowledge his historical importance, though they continued to critique his methods. Mao Zedong, then leading communist forces in the Chinese Civil War, made no public statement about Gandhi's death. The two men had never met and represented fundamentally opposed philosophies. Gandhi believed in non-violent transformation, Mao in revolutionary violence. But Mao clearly learned from Gandhi's example, particularly his ability to mobilize peasant masses, even if he used those lessons toward violent rather than non-violent ends. Perhaps most significantly, Gandhi's assassination and the way India responded to it provided a kind of template for how newly independent nations could navigate the transition from colonialism. The fact that India held together after Gandhi's death, that it didn't descend into complete chaos, that it managed to establish a functioning democracy despite enormous challenges, all this gave hope to other independence movements around the world. Leaders of independence movements in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East studied India's example carefully. Some adopted Gandhi's methods of non-violent resistance. Others concluded that non-violence wasn't enough, that armed struggle was necessary. But all of them had to grapple with Gandhi's legacy, with his demonstration that colonialism could be defeated without matching the colonizers' violence. Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, Tanzania's Julius Nyerere, Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta, all these African leaders who would guide their nations to independence studied Gandhi's methods and learned from India's experience. Some copied directly, others adapted, still others rejected Gandhi's approach. But they couldn't ignore him. In the Palestinian territories, Gandhi's philosophy influenced some resistance movements, though the predominant approach became armed struggle. In Tibet, the Dalai Lama adopted Gandhi's philosophy wholesale, committing to non-violent resistance against Chinese occupation even when it seemed futile. In Burma, Aung San Suu Kyi explicitly modelled her resistance to military dictatorship on Gandhi's methods. The global reach of Gandhi's influence meant that his assassination reverberated worldwide. It wasn't just India that lost something when he died. It was every movement for justice and liberation that had looked to him as an example, every oppressed people who had hoped that non-violence might be enough. His death raised fundamental questions that movements for social change still grapple with today. Is non-violence strong enough to overcome entrenched power? Can moral witness defeat state violence? What do you do when your opponents don't respect your non-violence, when they're willing to kill you for practicing it? Gandhi's answer was always that non-violence was not a technique, but a way of life, not a tactic but a principle. You practiced it not because it was strategically effective, but because it was morally right. If you died practicing non-violence, that was preferable to living through violence. Your death, if you faced it with courage and dignity, could itself be a form of resistance, could shame your opponents and inspire your allies. It's a beautiful philosophy, but a demanding one. Not everyone can be a Gandhi, can accept death rather than compromise principles. Most people, most movements, eventually conclude that survival matters more than purity, that sometimes violence is necessary, that the perfect can't be the enemy of the good. But Gandhi's example remains a kind of moral North Star, even for those who can't fully follow it. His assassination didn't discredit his philosophy. In some ways, it validated it. He died as he lived, refusing violence even when faced with violence, choosing to die rather than kill. Whether that makes him a saint or a fool depends on your perspective, but it makes him unforgettable. Part 8. The legacy that lives and dies, the Gandhi who emerged from the crucible of those final 17 days and the martyrdom that followed, is both more and less than the man who actually lived. He became India's secular saint, the father of the nation, an icon so universally revered that criticising him became almost taboo in mainstream Indian discourse for decades. Yet this very veneration often obscured the complexity of what he actually believed and what his death truly meant. In the immediate years following 1948, Gandhi's presence loomed over every major decision India made. When the Constituent Assembly debated the new nation's direction, delegates invoked Gandhi's name constantly, usually to support their own preferred policies, regardless of whether Gandhi would have actually agreed. Nehru spoke of building Gandhi's India, while pursuing industrialization and centralized planning that contradicted everything Gandhi had written about village-based economies and decentralized power. The contradiction was most stark in matters of violence and state power. Gandhi had opposed not just war, but the very concept of a standing army, believing a truly non-violent nation needed no military. He'd written extensively about how independent India should abolish its military and rely instead on non-violent resistance against any aggressor. A nation that has no army will not be attacked, he'd argued, with the kind of idealism that sounds beautiful but impossibly naive when you're actually governing. Yet within months of his death, India found itself in a shooting war with Pakistan over Kashmir. Nehru, the man who'd called Gandhi his mentor and spiritual guide, ordered Indian troops into battle without apparent conflict about contradicting Gandhi's teachings. The practical demands of governing trumped philosophical purity. India needed an army, needed to defend its borders, needed to be taken seriously in a world that respected military power. Similarly, Gandhi had opposed the death penalty under all circumstances, believing that no state had the right to take a life, and that even murderers could be redeemed through love and non-violent persuasion. Yet the Indian government executed his assassin and co-conspirator without serious debate about whether this contradicted Gandhi's principles. The man was being honoured even as his teachings were being set aside. This pattern would repeat throughout independent India's history. Gandhi's image adorned stamps and currency. His birthday became a national holiday. Schools taught his life story. Politicians quoted him constantly, but the actual substance of his philosophy, radical non-violence, religious syncretism, economic localism, opposition to industrialization, rejection of Western modernity, was largely ignored or relegated to symbolic gestures. Village industries were promoted in theory but never really prioritized in economic planning. The spinning wheel Gandhi had made the symbol of independence became a quaint artifact rather than a model for economic development. His vision of Gram Swaraj, village self-rule, gave way to a highly centralized bureaucratic state. His opposition to untouchability was enshrined in the constitution, but caste discrimination persisted in practice. The result was a curious kind of double consciousness in Indian public life. Gandhi was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. His moral authority was invoked constantly, but his actual prescriptions were followed rarely. He became a symbol rather than a guide, a founding myth rather than a living philosophy. Part of this was inevitable. No single person's vision, however brilliant, can serve as a complete blueprint for governing a nation as vast and complex as India. Gandhi himself acknowledged this toward the end of his life, recognizing that his own ideas about economics and governance were perhaps more aspirational than practical. He'd once told Nehru, "You will build the India that's possible. I can only dream of the India that should be." But the gap between veneration and implementation created problems that would compound over decades. By treating Gandhi as a secular saint, rather than a political thinker whose ideas could be debated and critiqued, India made it difficult to honestly assess which of his ideas had merit and which didn't. His philosophy became frozen in amber, preserved but not developed, honoured but not engaged with seriously. The Muslim community's relationship with Gandhi's memory was particularly poignant. He died trying to protect them, had undertaken his final fast to ensure their safety in Delhi, had literally given his life defending the principle of religious pluralism. Many Muslims named their children after him, hung his portrait in their homes alongside religious imagery, viewed him as the one Hindu leader they could truly trust. Yet Gandhi's death also left them terrifyingly vulnerable. Without his moral authority to shield them, Muslims in India faced recurring waves of communal violence over the decades. The 1969 Gujarat riots, the 1984 Bhagalpur riots, the 1992-93 Bombay riots following the Babri Masjid demolition, the 2002 Gujarat pogrom. Each of these tragedies involved Hindu mobs attacking Muslim communities, while police often stood by or participated. Gandhi's dream of Hindu-Muslim unity died a little more with each outbreak of violence. Some Muslims came to feel that Gandhi's legacy had been appropriated by a Hindu-majority state that paid lip service to secularism while failing to protect minorities in practice. The Congress Party claimed to be Gandhi's heir, but increasingly failed to prevent anti-Muslim violence or to adequately punish its perpetrators. Gandhi's image became in some quarters a kind of false promise, a symbol of tolerance that masked persistent discrimination. Others, however, clung to Gandhi's memory precisely because of what he represented, the possibility of an India where religion didn't determine citizenship, where pluralism wasn't just tolerated, but celebrated, where a Hindu could die defending Muslims without it being seen as betrayal. For these Muslims, Gandhi remained a beacon of hope, that the true India of diversity and coexistence might someday prevail over the forces of religious nationalism. The Hindu nationalist movement that had produced Gandhi's assassin didn't disappear after 1948. It went dormant, adapted, and eventually re-emerged stronger than before. The RSS, after being banned for nearly 2 years, was allowed to operate again in 1949, only after it agreed to adopt a written constitution, eschew violence, and accept India's secular framework. It complied formally while ideologically remaining committed to the vision of India as fundamentally a Hindu nation. Over the following decades, Hindu nationalism built a network of organisations, cultural, educational, religious, and eventually political. The BJP emerged as its political wing in 1980, and slowly but steadily gained electoral success. By 2014, it had won an outright majority in Parliament and formed a government under Narendra Modi. By 2024, it had thoroughly dominated Indian politics. The supreme irony is that this movement has managed to appropriate aspects of Gandhi's legacy even while pursuing policies he would have opposed. BJP leaders regularly pay homage at Gandhi's memorial, quote him in speeches, and invoke his name as a nationalist icon. But their nationalism is the particularist, religiously defined nationalism Gandhi explicitly rejected, not the inclusive, pluralistic nationalism he promoted. This selective appropriation reached absurd heights when some BJP politicians began claiming that Gandhi had secretly been sympathetic to Hindu nationalism, that he'd only promoted Hindu-Muslim unity out of political necessity, that if he'd lived longer, he would have recognised the need for a stronger Hindu identity. It's a profound misreading of Gandhi's actual beliefs, but it demonstrates how completely his image has been divorced from his substance. The most chilling manifestation came when fringe elements of Hindu nationalism began openly celebrating Nathuram Godse as a hero rather than a villain. In the 2010s, books praising Godse appeared in bookstores. Plays depicting him sympathetically were performed. Online forums celebrated him as a patriot who'd made the ultimate sacrifice to save Hindu interests. Some Hindu nationalist activists even attempted to build a temple to Godse in the state of Maharashtra. These efforts were widely condemned and remained marginal, but their very existence demonstrated how far from Gandhi's vision parts of India had drifted. The man who'd killed the apostle of nonviolence was being praised as a defender of the faith. The assassin was being transformed into a martyr. It was everything Gandhi had feared, and everything his death was supposed to have prevented. Yet the story isn't entirely bleak. Gandhi's influence on global movements for justice remained profound and grew over time. When Martin Luther King Jr. travelled to India in 1959 to study Gandhi's methods, he returned to the United States with renewed commitment to nonviolent resistance. The American civil rights movement that King led became perhaps the fullest implementation of Gandhi's philosophy outside India itself. The images from the civil rights era, peaceful protesters being beaten by police, students sitting quietly at segregated lunch counters while being harassed, marchers singing spirituals as they faced dogs and fire hoses, were direct applications of Gandhi's tactics. King's letter from Birmingham jail, with its moral appeals and willingness to accept suffering, could have been written by Gandhi himself. When King was assassinated in 1968, the parallels to Gandhi were immediately apparent. Another apostle of nonviolence killed by those who rejected his message. Another prophet whose death accomplished politically what his life had struggled to achieve. King's assassination sparked the passage of civil rights legislation that had been stalled in Congress. Another martyr whose memory would be both honoured and domesticated. His radical message softened to make him acceptable to the very power structures he'd challenged. The anti-apartheid movement in South Africa similarly drew on Gandhi's legacy, though in complicated ways. Gandhi had lived in South Africa for 21 years, developing his philosophy there. But his record on race was troubling. He'd often distinguished between Indians and native Africans, in ways that suggested he viewed Indians as superior, and his early campaigns focused on securing rights for Indians specifically rather than opposing racial hierarchy generally. Nelson Mandela acknowledged Gandhi's influence, but also recognised these limitations. The African National Congress initially tried Gandhi's non-violent methods, but eventually concluded that armed resistance was necessary against a regime that met non-violence with massacre. When Mandela was finally released from prison in 1990 and worked to prevent civil war during South Africa's transition to democracy, he drew on both Gandhi and his own hard-won wisdom that sometimes you need to compromise with reality rather than insist on purity. In Eastern Europe, when communist regimes began to fall in 1989, some of the movements that toppled them drew inspiration from Gandhi. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the Solidarity movement in Poland, the peaceful protests that ended East German communism, these weren't purely Gandhian movements, but they shared his conviction that oppressive regimes could be challenged through moral witness and mass non-violent resistance. Václav Havel, the Czech playwright who became president, explicitly invoked Gandhi's concept of living in truth as a form of resistance. The simple act of refusing to participate in the lies of an authoritarian system, of maintaining moral integrity even at personal cost. This was deeply Gandhian, even if Havel arrived at it through different philosophical routes. The environmental movement, particularly in its more radical manifestations, also drew on Gandhi's philosophy. His critique of industrial modernity, his emphasis on simple living, his conviction that endless material growth was spiritually corrosive. These ideas found new relevance as environmental crises mounted. The Chipko movement in India, where villagers hugged trees to prevent them from being cut down, was a direct application of Gandhian tactics to environmental protection. Yet here too, the gap between principle and practice remained vast. India, while claiming Gandhi as its father, pursued development policies that devastated the environment. Rapid industrialization polluted rivers and air. Massive dam projects displaced millions of villagers. Cities sprawled chaotically, consuming agricultural land. The India Gandhi had envisioned, ecologically sustainable, valuing simplicity over growth, never materialized. By the early 21st century, 75 years after Gandhi's death, India faced a reckoning with his legacy. The nation had achieved remarkable things, maintained democracy for 7 decades when many predicted it would fail, lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, developed a space program and nuclear weapons, emerged as a major global power. These were impressive accomplishments by any measure. But India had also failed to achieve many of Gandhi's core aspirations. Religious violence continued to flare regularly. Caste discrimination persisted despite laws against it. Income inequality had exploded, creating a society more stratified than Gandhi could have imagined. Politics had become increasingly corrupt and communal. The simple, peaceful, spiritually grounded society Gandhi envisioned seemed further away than ever. The question that haunted thoughtful Indians was whether Gandhi's vision had been impractical from the start, a beautiful dream unsuited to the harsh realities of governing, or whether India had simply chosen the wrong path, abandoning his wisdom in favour of easier but ultimately self-destructive choices. There was no easy answer. Probably both were partly true. Gandhi's prescriptions for economic life, his opposition to machinery, his advocacy for village self-sufficiency, his romanticisation of traditional Indian village life, were likely never going to work for a nation aspiring to modernity and prosperity. He himself had acknowledged that his economic ideas were more spiritual than practical, more about cultivating the right attitudes than implementing specific policies. But his core insight, that means matter as much as ends, that you cannot achieve good through evil methods, that violence breeds more violence while non-violence can transform conflicts, remained profoundly relevant. India's failures weren't because it followed Gandhi too faithfully, but because it honoured him in word while abandoning him in deed. The communal violence that continued to plague India, the corruption that infected its politics, the environmental devastation wrought by unchecked development, the growing inequality, these weren't inevitable consequences of modernisation. They were results of specific choices made by leaders who claimed to revere Gandhi while ignoring his warnings about what happens when material progress becomes divorced from moral progress. Final reflections, the unfinished journey. When we examine Gandhi's last 17 days through the lens of history, what becomes most striking is not what was resolved, but what remains unfinished. His assassination froze a moment in time, a nation in crisis, a philosophy being tested, a man doubting his life's work, without providing clear answers to the questions that tormented him. Did his fast really change hearts, or did it merely extract convenient promises? Would the pledges of communal harmony have lasted had he lived? Could non-violence truly have prevented Partition's horrors, or was he fighting against forces too powerful for any individual to control? We'll never know the answers because history didn't give him time to discover them. What we do know is that the India, which emerged from those 17 days, bore the permanent marks of that crucible. The Constitution, finalised 2 years after his death, enshrined many of his values: secularism, equality, religious freedom, the abolition of untouchability. But it also rejected many of his prescriptions, creating a powerful centralised state, embracing industrialisation, maintaining military forces. The architects of independent India, particularly Nehru and Ambedkar, consciously chose to honour Gandhi selectively. They took his moral authority and his symbolic power while setting aside his economic philosophy and his opposition to modernity. They built institutions he would have questioned while insisting they were fulfilling his legacy. This selective appropriation has characterised Indian engagement with Gandhi for 3/4 of a century. Every political movement claims him. Every party invokes his name. Every October 2nd, his birthday, sees ritualistic tributes, flower laying at his memorials, speeches praising his vision. Yet the actual practice of Indian politics often contradicts everything he believed. The corruption that pervades Indian politics and bureaucracy would have appalled Gandhi, who lived simply and viewed material attachment as spiritually corrosive. The periodic outbreaks of communal violence would have broken his heart. The growing economic inequality, with billionaires emerging as India, developed while hundreds of millions remained desperately poor, contradicts his vision of economic justice. The environmental degradation caused by rapid, unplanned development violates his emphasis on living in harmony with nature. Yet, it would be unfair to judge India harshly for failing to fully implement Gandhi's vision. No nation of 1.4 billion people, containing such diversity of languages, religions and cultures, facing such enormous challenges of poverty and development, could perfectly embody any single person's philosophy. The miracle is not that India fell short of Gandhian ideals, but that it managed to maintain democracy, protect minority rights to a significant degree, and develop economically while avoiding complete disintegration. The comparison with Pakistan is instructive. Both nations emerged from the same partition, faced similar challenges, contained similar diversity. Yet Pakistan descended into military dictatorship repeatedly, suffered through multiple coups, struggled with religious extremism, and never achieved stable democracy. India, despite all its flaws and failures, has conducted regular elections for 75 years, transferred power peacefully between parties, maintained civilian control of the military, and protected press freedom and civil liberties, though these have eroded recently. This relative success owes something to Gandhi's legacy, not to his specific policy prescriptions, but to the values he embedded in India's founding mythology. The idea that India should be a secular state where all religions are equal. The conviction that diversity is strength rather than weakness. The belief that moral authority matters in politics. The expectation that leaders should at least pretend to care about the poor and marginalised. These Gandhian principles, even when honoured more in rhetoric than practice, created standards by which Indian leaders could be judged and held accountable. The question for contemporary India is whether these principles will survive the resurgence of Hindu nationalism. The BJP government that has dominated Indian politics since 2014 represents a fundamental challenge to Gandhian secularism. Its vision of India as essentially a Hindu nation, where religious minorities exist on sufferance rather than as equal citizens, directly contradicts Gandhi's pluralistic nationalism. This isn't just about policy disputes or normal democratic alternation between parties. It's about competing visions of Indian identity, whether India is defined by territorial nationalism open to all citizens regardless of religion, Gandhi's vision, or by Hindu civilization and culture, to which others must accommodate, the Hindu nationalist vision that motivated Gandhi's assassin. The fact that this debate continues 75 years after Gandhi's death suggests that his assassination didn't permanently resolve the fundamental question it posed. It merely suppressed Hindu nationalism for several decades, driving it underground, where it adapted and eventually re-emerged stronger. The tension between inclusive and exclusive nationalism, between secular and religious definitions of nationhood, between Gandhian pluralism and Hindutva particularism, remains the central fault line in Indian politics. Recent developments have been troubling for those who value Gandhi's legacy. Communal violence has increased. Muslims face discrimination in employment, housing, and justice. Lynchings of Muslims accused of eating beef, or of love jihad, having relationships with Hindu women, occur with disturbing regularity. Hate speech against Muslims has become increasingly mainstream. The government has passed laws that critics argue discriminate against Muslims, such as the Citizenship Amendment Act. Meanwhile, Gandhi's actual assassins have been partially rehabilitated in some Hindu nationalist circles. Books and plays presenting Godse sympathetically have found audiences. Online forums celebrate him as a patriot. Though these remain fringe views, their very existence would have been unthinkable in the decades immediately following the assassination. At the same time, Gandhi's global reputation has become more complicated. Revelations about his attitudes toward Africans during his South Africa years, about his experiments with celibacy involving young women, about his treatment of his own family, have prompted some to question his moral authority. Statues of Gandhi in some countries have been vandalized or removed. Academic conferences debate whether he should still be held up as a moral exemplar given his flaws. This reassessment is in some ways healthy. The plaster saint needed to be humanized, his actual beliefs and behaviors examined critically rather than accepted uncritically. But it also risks losing the insight Gandhi genuinely offered, dismissing everything he said because of his personal failings or outdated views on some issues. The challenge is to hold both truths simultaneously, that Gandhi was a flawed human being who held some views we now recognise as wrong, and that he articulated moral insights that remain profoundly important. That he was sometimes hypocritical or controlling in his personal relationships, and that his public philosophy of nonviolent resistance genuinely changed how oppressed people could fight for justice, that he had blind spots about race and gender and caste, and that he was far more progressive on these issues than most of his contemporaries, and genuinely evolved his thinking over time. This kind of nuanced assessment, neither hagiography nor dismissal, is what Gandhi himself would likely have preferred. He was always honest about his own struggles and failures, always portrayed himself as a seeker rather than a saint, always insisted that people should test his ideas rather than blindly accept them. His experiments with truth, as he called his autobiography, were just that, experiments. Some succeeded, others failed. Some insights proved lasting. Others were products of his particular time and place. But the spirit of experimentation, of being willing to test ideas in practice and learn from failures, of prioritizing lived ethics over abstract philosophy, this methodological approach remains valuable. Conclusion: the prayer meeting continues. As we reach the end of this bedtime biography, having traced Gandhi's final 17 days from his fast on January 13th through his assassination on January 30th and its aftermath, what can we finally say about how those days changed a nation? The most honest answer is profoundly, but incompletely. Those 17 days revealed India to itself, showed it both its best aspirations and its worst impulses, its capacity for unity and its vulnerability to division, its potential for moral greatness and its susceptibility to hatred. They created a founding narrative that has shaped Indian identity for 3/4 of a century. But they didn't resolve the fundamental tensions that Gandhi grappled with. India is still negotiating between religious pluralism and religious nationalism, between non-violent ideals and violent realities, between inclusive and exclusive definitions of who belongs. The prayer meeting Gandhi was walking toward when he died, a gathering where Hindus, Muslims, and others worshipped together, heard readings from multiple scriptures, affirmed their common humanity, remains an aspiration more than a reality. Some nights, as you're drifting off to sleep, perhaps you'll think about that last walk, an elderly man, barely 90 pounds, leaning on two young women who loved him, hurrying because he's late, greeting people with folded hands and a gentle smile, not knowing that death waits just ahead. The ordinariness of it, the garden path, the familiar routine, the waiting crowd, makes it somehow more, rather than less, tragic. He was just going to prayer. He'd done it hundreds of times before. He would have done it hundreds of times more if he'd lived. It was the most mundane of activities, elevated into a spiritual practice, the simple act of gathering people together to remember what they shared rather than what divided them. That's what makes the assassination so devastating. Not just that Gandhi died, but that he died trying to do something so simple and so necessary. Bringing people together, affirming common humanity, choosing peace over violence. These shouldn't require martyrdom. They shouldn't cost anyone their life. But sometimes they do. The 17 days between Gandhi's fast and his assassination were a window into India's soul, into every nation's soul, really. The struggle to choose unity over division, peace over revenge, principle over expedience, hope over despair. Gandhi chose over and over, even when it seemed futile, even when he doubted it would work, even unto death. Did his choice change India? Yes. Permanently? No. Enough. That depends on whether you measure against perfection or against realistic alternatives. India is not the nation Gandhi dreamed of, but it's probably better than the nation that would have emerged without him. His 17 days and the martyrdom that ended them bought India time, space, and moral resources it desperately needed. The prayer meeting continues, in a sense, whenever Indians resist communalism, defend pluralism, choose dialogue over violence. And it's interrupted again and again whenever hatred erupts, whenever demagogues exploit religious divisions, whenever Godse's vision temporarily prevails over Gandhi's. This is the unfinished quality of those 17 days. They changed India profoundly, but they didn't finish the job. They couldn't, because the work Gandhi began is never finished. Every generation must choose between his vision and Godse's, between inclusive and exclusive nationalism, between the hard path of nonviolence and the easy descent into communal rage. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps take comfort in this, that one frail old man showed us what it looks like to refuse hatred even when hated, to choose non-violence even when surrounded by violence, to keep walking toward prayer even when death waits along the path. His final 17 days were a masterclass in moral courage, imperfect, doubting, very human courage, but courage nonetheless. The light went out, Nehru said, but he was wrong. The light flickers, sometimes dims, occasionally seems extinguished, but it never completely goes out. It shines in every act of communal harmony, every defence of minority rights, every choice of peace over revenge. It shines in the millions of Indians who reject religious nationalism, who insist on secular democracy, who honour all of Gandhi's vision and not just his image. Gandhi's last days changed India by showing what was possible and what was at stake, by demonstrating that moral courage could move mountains even when it couldn't prevent murder, by creating a martyrdom that gave birth to a nation's conscience. India is still being born from that martyrdom, still struggling to become what Gandhi glimpsed in those final 17 days. A nation where all could worship together, where ahimsa was more than a word, where the prayer meeting he died walking toward could finally, truly, permanently begin. Rest well, dear friends. Tomorrow the struggle continues, the prayer meeting awaits, and somewhere, perhaps, An old man in white smiles and walks on, no longer late, no longer vulnerable, no longer doubting, but still committed to that same simple truth, that love is stronger than hatred, that non-violence can overcome violence, that the light, though dimmed, can never be extinguished. Good night.